There we go.
Okay, welcome. This is our class on classical molding types. I'm Jay Cantrell. I'm the teacher, and I really want to thank Valerie Wood for inviting me to do this prestigious honor. I've taught the drawing classes before, I think back in December and January, but I'm going to be doing a series of lectures on classical moldings, particularly the classical orders and other classes. There's a schedule you can look at. But today we're really going to be reviewing classical molding types. I'm just going to kind of quickly go through each one of this. I'm just going to quickly go through some of the slides to show what we're going to actually discuss today. There's a list of things, a category of moldings, smaller pieces that make up a larger whole, moldings on classical orders and applications, and terminology of more elaborate moldings, such as I think you've heard probably some of the details for egg and dart, bead and reel, the water leaf molds and the dentils. These are a lot more ambitious moldings than the first one you're going to talk about. So the next one is a chart of a category of molding types. Here's a little pieces that make up a larger whole. We're going to talk about that, how these are actually applied onto the classical orders, which we'll get into just more in detail in just a minute. And then how they're actually drawn and constructed. They're definitely not arbitrarily thought of. They're very carefully done. So the next one would be, we're going to just do a brief overview of what the actual orders are. There's really 5 basic orders with several variations. They're going to talk about the nature of integral moldings versus decorative. Then we're going to talk about what I mentioned earlier about different types of moldings that are actually applied to a much larger whole. These are all the moldings that we're going to be looking at earlier into one large, fantastic building. Let's kind of go back to the original orders. I know some of you of course, have seen these in observation, probably haven't really understood what these are, but there's really 3 basic orders that the ancient Greeks established: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. Doric is one of the simpler ones. Ionic, of course, has the volutes at the top, at the capital. Then the Corinthian one is one of the more elaborate ones, which mixes the acanthus leaves with the tendrils to make the Corinthian capital. There's actually really 5. The one on the left is the Tuscan order, which was originated in the Romans. It's the simplest order. It doesn't have a lot of detail in the frieze or a lot of other details. And then the one on the right is the composite order, which is actually incorporated into the Renaissance, which is a mixture of, you can see the mixture of the Corinthian and the Ionic. So what they're mixing are the Ionic volutes with the acanthus leaves on the capitals for the composite order. Again, there's more variations. You can compare the Greek orders, and there's even a special Roman order, which of course gets to larger buildings because the Romans intensified their great vocabulary of architecture. They made the Doric, Ionic, Corinthian more elaborate. So let's kind of go back to some of the very fundamental molding profiles. Again, these are very small pieces, really comprised of just either half circles, either convex ones, concave ones, then there's a few elliptical ones. So all of these parts here are applied. If you look at the chart on the right, it shows a small little section of a cornice and a column capital. So pretty much all of these smaller pieces are used to make, this is the Tuscan order, to adorn the classical orders. So pretty much all these little parts here are applied onto each one of the orders, the 5 orders: Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and composite. So what you're seeing is all the little pieces originally in the small chart are applied and multiplied and made more elaborate on each one of the orders. The next image I'm going to show you is how the moldings are actually constructed, which means how are they properly proportioned. If you look at this chart, you're probably wondering, what are those small little diagrams on the left there? What I'm going to show you is, in the image before that, each columnar order is proportioned by the number of diameters. You look at the little circle, the diameter on the Tuscan order is that the height of the columns is determined by each one of the columns' diameters. So in other words, 7 diameters fit to make the Tuscan order the height of the column. 8 columns in plan just add up to the height of the Doric column. The same thing with Ionic, it gets 9, and then the Corinthian composite is more like 10 diameters. So when you look at this chart or this diagram, what they're showing you is each one of the little parts are based on the width of the diameter of the column. It's really remarkable to think that every little increment is proportioned based on the diameter. If you look at 7, 6, D that's 7/6 diameters. Um, the base is one full diameter. Later, when of course when they start tapering, they have to reduce the number of the dimensions of the diameters of the columns. So pretty much every little increment is based on the diameter of the column, which is proportional for each one of the orders. So if you take a look at this example, you know, the cave molding and some of the Scotia moldings are based on each little increment. And there's a terminology for each part of the column. On the top of this, of course, is the capital. The top is called the abacus. The curved concave piece is the echinus, then the necking, and then the astragal. So pretty much each little detail has parts of some of the earlier charts that we looked at previously. I'll kind of leave this up for a minute. When I held the drawing class, we were actually manually drew each one of these parts. It took about several hours to carefully draw. This is the Tuscan order to figure out the diameter of the column, draw the height in each one of these little parts. You can see that we're using, 45-degree angles to determine some of the proportions of these parts. For me to discuss each part for every columnar order would probably take several hours. This is just kind of a short introduction to how classical moldings are originated and of course applied. Okay, so this chart is showing the geometry of things. We're using full circles, part circles, diagonals to actually properly proportion the proper dimensions of every little part on this. It's remarkable to think that everything was so carefully done in each one of these orders that nothing is really arbitrarily placed. Everything is proportioned exactly based on each one of the diameters. So we talk about the language of classical architecture relative to the moldings. The nature of the column is, if you look at this, it's the base, the shaft, and the capital itself. And then of course, this is the entablature. The entablature is comprised, if you can see the details on the left, the architrave is of course the large beam. The frieze is the intermediate piece between the architrave and the cornice. So these three parts, the cornice, frieze, and architrave, are comprised of what's called the entablature. So each one of these parts is explicitly, carefully proportioned on each one of the orders. You can see by the time we get to composite, the entablature, which still incorporates the architrave, the frieze, and the cornice, is much larger than some of the other orders, especially the Tuscan is the smallest, simplest order. So again, all the moldings that we looked at earlier are still applied here in varying degrees of kind of reinvention of things. What's interesting is this diagram is showing you kind of early Etruscan temple. And of course, the Etruscan temple is where we get the Tuscan column. Really, the earlier temples were really built out of wood. The columns are stone. Later in Greek societies and Roman societies, is that they're abstracting the wooden temple from the Etruscan times and building that out of stone and marble. So what you see here is if you look at the astragal, which is the gap between the architrave and the frieze, is that this is a decorative piece that's cut out of a piece of stone. The image on the left shows that the wooden parts, these are actually the nailing pins to connect the beams, which has the frieze onto the architrave below that. So, so this is actually the true nature of construction in wood. Then in Greek and Roman buildings, those are actually stylized and created in stone and marble. So what you're looking at is these are the wooden beams that support the roof. So of course, they're literally the ends of the wooden beams. So if you look at the part on the right, those are called triglyphs, which are stone carved out to look at the short end of the beams. So really the frieze is comprised of what used to really look like the wooden construction in an early Etruscan temple. I just think that's an interesting relationship that they're still, making it look like it's constructed out of wood, but it's really made out of stone or marble. So this is a more elaborate detail of the actual a Greek temple that is comprised of wooden roof, of course, of stone or marble parts. And this is a case where, if you look at this, the moldings are an integrated part of the structure. It's not applied. If this is probably wood, that would have been nailed on. Of course, they're stone and marble. They're carved out of one piece. So when we talk about classical moldings, moldings do serve not just a decorative purpose, but a functional purpose. If you look at the column capital, the column dies into the square base, the abacus at the top. Then there's a transition piece between the square and the rounded column. Of course, it's called the capital. And in Doric and Tuscan orders, those are very simple, smooth curve. If you look at the Ionic and Doric order, then the transition between the shaft and the capital is much more elaborate. We have the volutes for the Ionic capitals. Of course, we have the acanthus leaves for the Corinthian composite. So that's the top of the building. Let's take a look at the base. This is a wonderful, this is a very soft limestone base. Look at these. These are made up of the profiles of each one of the catalog pieces that we looked at earlier. Now, this is a cut stone base. They're not little pieces of molding applied. They're actually cut out of a solid block. This is, built in the 1920s, really before we were, using a lot of power tools. So these are all manually carved out with chisels. It's just remarkable to see that this is actually one piece of stone just to make the double base of which is called the Ionic order. This is Roman Ionic. So the Roman Ionic order has multiple curves and scotia molds for each one of these parts. So here's, of course, the flat facade for the Ionic order. You can see multiple moldings, which we'll talk about in a minute. This particular facade has all the moldings, which we're going to be discussing: the egg and dart mold, the water leaf, and of course the dental molds. So let's look at some more elaborate molding profiles that are, a far cry more complex than the earlier stuff we looked at in the charts. This is called the water leaf plus the bead and reel. The bead and reel is pretty explanatory. It just has, see, little beads in between a large reel that comprises the entire length of an entablature cornice. So let's go back to this one. The water leaf, I'm not sure the etymology of the word. The water leaf, of course, it's not an acanthus leaf that's on the Corinthian capital, but for the most part, the leaves are a decorative part of this detail. The egg and dart is pretty visibly suffixed. There's a large egg-shaped piece. There's a spear or probably a dart in between these, sandwiched in between transitional parts, which are leaves. So normally the egg and dart is either mixed with the beading reel as a very small profile. It's a linear element underneath to transition from a flat plane to, of course, this is probably applied onto a cornice. Then, of course, the dental mold, its literal name, of course, is these little teeth. The dental molds are little square that are placed underneath. They're very small bracket-like forms. They're really in between the egg and dart, the bead and reel, and of course, the water leaf profile underneath that. Of course, this would be the cornice underneath the main. This is the transition from the frieze to the cornice. This is a very typical molding profile between the cornice and, of course, the frieze. And these are just some wonderful curvilinear details. You can even see the egg and dart mold is carved out of the Greek Ionic capital. And you can see another part of the entablature from the ancient ruin, is that you can see the small water leaf profile, which takes the place of an astragal, which you've seen earlier, and then the bead and reel, of course, and then the egg and dart. And it's interesting to see the visible transition between how do you connect the bead and reel and the egg and dart to the Ionic volute. You can see there's a floral-like form that covers up that's unresolved gap between the two parts. Surprisingly, this is carved probably out of one block of stone or marble. So again, we see a very elegant, simple profile, not quite as large as if you're looking at the entablatures or details for the composite or the Corinthian orders, that some of the details in here are very simple and a little bit more linear and elegant, some of the other larger stuff that we're going to see in a minute. This is a section of Michelangelo's wonderful, the Capitoline Hill facade. He did incredible work. Of course, his architecture is more sculptural because, of course, he began as a sculptor. And you can see his playful Ionic volutes are adorned with festoons, and you can see the egg and dart mold in between, the link between the diagonal volutes. And of course, the capital, of course, has the echinus and, the abacus, and of course, the astragal, which is a transition piece between the shaft and, of course, the capital. Pretty much all the columns have this molding, which is an integral part of the stone, or of course, the wood. This is called the astragal for the column. Then this is the astragal for the architrave between the frieze and, of course, the architrave. Again, this is an image of, this is the Magnolia Hotel in downtown Dallas. It has Of course, they're modeling parts of these based, it's neoclassical because, they're borrowing the classical styles from ancient Greece and Rome. So you can see pretty much all the moldings are beautifully comprised in this one section. The same image that we saw earlier here on the frieze. Here's a more concise kind of a basic diagram of the parts of the column and the entablature. You can definitely see that this is without any of the details of the moldings. We can see the nature of just the architectural order, which is comprised of the column, the shaft, the capital, of course, the three parts that make the entablature, the architrave, frieze, and the cornice. So pretty much all the moldings that we saw before that either articulate the joints or express a certain detail in it. So the moldings are the moldings are definitely not arbitrarily placed. They do serve a function. They're very carefully placed between the transition of each one of these parts. Okay, let me go back to some of these diagrams for a minute. So what we just saw earlier is just kind of a mixture of how each molding profile is accentuated and interpreted based on each columnar order. So this is really not, this of course is a layout of the Tuscan order, but pretty much each columnar order has this language of the parts and the nomenclature that we're looking at. So pretty much all the moldings that we've seen here, the base, the shaft, the capital, the entablature, is based off of each one of these parts. They're all mixed together. If you start carefully studying how the moldings are implied into each one of the orders, is that there's a kind of a difference between Greek and Roman orders of architecture. By the time the Roman Empire was implemented, is that the cities became larger, there were more people, the buildings became larger. So the orders are much larger in Roman, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, and composite. So what you're seeing is the Roman orders are much more elaborate than, of course, the ancient Greek. You can see the three Greek orders here, Greek, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. When you look at the Roman ones, the entablature is more elaborate than some of the early ones in the Greek. Or these are the little round diagrams are showing the plans of the columns. So again, if you look at this chart, they're starting to assemble each one of these parts to create a language of one of the orders. This little section here is showing profiles by function. In other words, some of the parts actually are specific pieces that make up only the cornice. Like you wouldn't see what's called the cyma recta probably as this is a section of the column capital. You really primarily see that at the cornice. So there's a specific place where each one of these pieces actually is applied onto the columnar order. So let's look at some terms. Cyma reversa, cyma recta. There's really two original profiles that are constantly being interchanged. The cyma recta is really the very top of the cornice of the crown mold. In other words, it's called cyma recta because it has two half circles that engage each other. Look at the one to the bottom right. It says cyma reversa. It's where the belly of the profile is actually at the top. It reverses and kind of flips things over. Those are two very common classical molding profiles, the cyma recta and the cyma reversa. Then, of course, we segue into some very simple half circles, convex and concaves, just to make some of the profiles. Like, in other words, this little detail is, of course, the base for some of the capitals, for some of the columns that we saw earlier. Let me scroll down to this one. By the time we get to Roman, Ionic, Corinthian base, if you look at this profile, this is even more elaborate detail than what we just saw earlier in the chart. So they're starting to mix and multiply some of the individual moldings based on each columnar order. I was going to end with, we still have some more time. I'm just going to have Michelle entertain some questions. A lot of the diagrams and some of the images were taken from William Ware, the American Vignola, which is kind of a catalog and a language of the classical order, specifically with the classical moldings. Some of these are taken from the 4 books of architecture and, of course, the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art Archive. So pretty much a lot of these drawings were drawn by members of the ICA, and of course comprised from several books that are on file. William Ware, of course, the 4 books of architecture. I think I'm going to segue over to Michelle. I'm sure she probably has a lot of questions. I've gone over a lot of information, so you might have me clarify some of the details, and I can go back look at some of the images. So I'll kind of turn it over to you, Michelle.
Okay. Hi, thanks. So I first just wanted to say that I thought that the comparison between the Greek and Roman orders was really interesting. If you can pull that slide up. Yeah, because when people think about, at least for me, when I think about classical, a lot of times the Greek and Roman architecture gets like grouped into one category. So having this clearly define the differences and the size and scale differences is really, really interesting to see. So I do appreciate that. Can we go back and maybe look at the way you figured out the column heights, or what determines column heights?
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a little hard to understand, because I think, because I'm giving the class for people that are designers and people that are simply observing, but it's really interesting to see that the height of the column is really determined by the number of diameters. And by that, I mean, if you look at the diagram on the left, the Tuscan order, it's only 7 diameters tall. So what you do is you take the circle of the diameter and you repeat it 7 times to determine the height. So by the time you get to Doric, that's 8. So you start adding more columns, which means the Corinthian and the composite is probably the tallest, or because it has 10 diameters tall. And so what you do is, for people that don't really understand how to properly use the language, what they'll do is they'll take a composite column and apply it onto a Tuscan column. Well, that looks ridiculous, because there's no way that would look proportional, because the Tuscan is only 7 diameters tall. It's going to look very short, which means the composite capital is going to be really overpowering for the scale, the height of the Tuscan order. So it's really rare. It looks obviously like there's a blatant mistake when you start putting the wrong capitals on each one of the orders. Again, really the Corinthian and composite orders are for very, very tall multi-level buildings. It's really strange to see a Corinthian capital on maybe a 1-story, 10-foot tall portico. It can be done, but it just looks a little bit forced and out of proportion when you do that. And so, yeah, does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. There was a slide where you kind of had a closer image and like the proportions of the Tuscan. It was up a ways, or maybe it was down. Can we go over that slide again and kind of how you determine those proportions? Yeah, that one.
Yes, these. Yeah, let me see if I can get this a little clearer. Yeah, let me see if I can make that smaller. Hold on just a second. Yeah, I think you can see this. Well, this chart, what it's showing, what are the, it looks like there are dimensions on the left side of this. Before I talk about the dimensions, again, this is really showing pretty much every classical order has this nomenclature. Of course, the base of the column, the shaft, which is the actual column itself, the capital, of course, the capital transitions from the entablature between the capital and, of course, the column itself. So really, to make the large entablature, there's really 3 parts: the architrave, the frieze, and the cornice. Then you're probably thinking, what are those dimensions? There's really not, they're not feet in inches or centimeters. They're showing you each one of these is a segment of the diameter of the column. In other words, if you look at this one, this is half of the column and subdivided into 6 different parts. So in other words, to determine the distance of what's called the astragal, the tinea, is that it's 6 parts of half of the diameter. I know it sounds very confusing, but this chart shows exactly how to proportion each little part of this using the diameter of the column. It's really amazing that the Greeks were so particular about the proportion of things that nothing fell out of place. It had to fit into one of the modules based on the diameter of the column itself. So obviously, this is the base of the column. This is 1 diameter in width. We talk about the tapering of the column is that by the time it gets from the base to, of course, the capital, it gets smaller. So really, the top of the diameter of the column is only 5/6 diameters wide. So each little corner, little curve, little nuance is based off of the dimension of column. So what I was saying is really, when contractors, sculptors, they didn't really need to rely on hundreds of drawings to, to properly proportion and construct a columnar order. They already knew how to measure things. The stonemasons knew the formula to do this. So you wouldn't have an architect do, 25 working drawings for one college, because back then they already knew the language of how to properly scale and construct things. Now a lot of, I hope this doesn't offend anyone, but just in terms of the construction industry that I'm in, is that a lot of them really don't really understand the language, how to properly, they drive around the neighborhood and just build things based on observation. And when they do that, it really sort of ruins the classical beauty of what originally was very carefully constructed in a certain module. And when I say formula, these of course, it's good to have formulas in architecture, but by the time you get to Mannerist architecture, Baroque, and some of the neoclassics, they start mixing things up. Of course, they have every right to do that, because we've seen the columnar orders reinstated many times through history. But when you look at serious architects, I can name hundreds of them, especially well-renowned architects, especially John Russell Pope, Michelangelo, Bernini, Borromini. They're still using the proper nomenclature for each one of the orders, even though they do add some details. Like I just showed you earlier, that Michelangelo kind of, derivated from a true Ionic capital because he was a certain type of magician and sculptor, and he can break the rules because he's already designed something before this in the very carefully constructed classical order. So he's deliberately making variations, and he has every right to do that because he was an unbelievable sculptor and architect. We don't really need to, explain that because he's already designed stuff in this very formal language. He can break the rules, if that kind of makes sense. So, this is really specifically for classical orders. But if you look at Baroque architecture, these profiles are very exaggerated. What is showing you in the last class is that in Baroque architecture, if you look at these profiles, they're it's almost like Borromini took these in Photoshop and stretched things out and made these things elliptical, really to have a certain amount of drama in the profiles. In other words, if you look at, if this wall were done by probably Borromini or Bernini, let me get back to this slide. Again, this wall is a very strict classical order. If this were designed by Borromini, the profiles would be much thicker, deeper, to have a larger shadow, because we're looking at chiaroscuro and painting and architecture, and everything was very more intensely bold and dramatic. So these are, really truly beautiful, pristine, unadulterated classical orders and language. And again, for me to explain how to properly portion each one of these, it would take several hours. If not, you could spend an entire semester on just how to properly draw and scale each order. Because the drawing seminar I taught, I think in the beginning of January, December, is that it took us probably about 9 hours to properly scale and draw this entire entablature in order. This is definitely not for the faint of heart, and definitely not quickly done in an hour. So this, you have to imagine that, the language of architecture, especially when the ancient Greeks and Romans, these were not built with power tools. I mean, it's just remarkable to think that these were chiseled out by hand, and they didn't have sophisticated drawing tools. I mean, especially the paper wasn't, readily available. So they were drawing things on stone and these large tablets. But it's just incredible to think, with very primitive tools, we had these magnificent buildings that were really built, for gods, not really people. So of course, the scale of architecture really is built for gods. And so, and then I think, Michelle, do you have any other questions or comments, or do you want me to elaborate on this image?
No, I think you did a good job explaining the Greek and Roman. It was just I noticed that I always, like I said, group them kind of together in my mind and forget that they were completely different, although similar when you look at them. Right. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to just kind of talk about this image for a minute. Yeah. I think, there's, if you look at any sort of research book for classical architecture, there are thousands of charts. It's a little bit overwhelming. It's like, which one do I look at? How do I proportion things?
Mm-hmm.
When you look at this chart, they're showing you the variation between Greek and Roman classical orders, because if you think about it, the Romans, of course, for their own culture and own language, are not about just blatantly copy and borrow what the ancient Greeks already did. So they elaborated and probably refined some of the dimensions. And by that, I mean, if you look at the thickness or the girth of the column and the Greek Doric orders, that they really didn't have, I mean, of course, they were brilliant engineers to actually structurally build these things, but they weren't as sophisticated as the Romans, because by the Romans, by this time, is that if you look at the Roman columns are thinner because they were able to maximize the structure and minimize the amount of material. Like, we don't need an enormous thickness for the column order, because by now the Romans have refined and clarified the proper structural dynamics. So we don't need an enormously thick column for Doric Roman architecture. We don't need one for Roman Ionic. So you can see that by the Roman culture is that the columns are thinner because they were able to maximize the structure and minimize the amount of material, which is just remarkable, because by now in the Roman cultures, the buildings are larger. We're using arches, not really post and lintel type of construction. And when we get into the classical orders this afternoon, this is really just because today was really about the moldings. You look at these things that, Greek architecture and columns, those are structural. Roman columns, of course, some of those are structural, but for the most part, Romans are decorative. If you look at the facade of the Colosseum, those pilasters are really not structural. They're not holding the building up. So it's interesting to compare the Greek architecture just by the columnar order and the Romans, just by these facts. You can definitely see that if you look at the Roman iron order versus the Greek one on the left, it's very complex, more elaborate. There's moldings everywhere, adorning the cornice and of course the entablature. So it gets more complex based on the specific order. And even, especially if you look at the this is a plan of the Capitol looking up this column here on the left. You can see my cursor, right? Michelle, can you see the cursor?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, I can see the
Okay,
cursor.
okay, good. So, these are plans of columns looking up at the capitals. The simplest one, of course, is the Doric, because we don't have the Ionic volute. So really in the Greek Ionic, they're flat. But if you look at the Roman capitals, they're starting to use the diagonals. So in other words, the 45 Corinthian and Ionic capitals are using, because the columns are now terminating in the corners. So if you look at the Roman ones, then of course the plan of the column looking up is that they're referencing the 45-degree diagonal. You wouldn't see this columnar planar detail in Greek Ionic because they're flat. And flat, I mean, they're not diagonally oriented. If you look at this image, this is just an incredible piece of carving and sculpture. Let me scroll down to this one for a minute. This is a Greek Ionic cabinet, but there's even a bead and reel carved in each one, calling the scrolls between the back of the Ionic capital and the front. That's just unbelievable work in detail. They could have just made this because I think these are abstracted papyrus rolls. They could have made this a simple shaft, but they were so passionate about their craftsmanship that they went to the trouble of carving every little bead and reel on a curve like that. This is
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, so this is just, I'm sorry, I have a habit of not going back and cleaning my work. This is just kind of a large architrave. The architrave, of course, I'm using the word architrave because it returns as a curve around a window. You can see the egg and dart, the bead and reel, the water leaf, the dental moss all together in one shot. I've seen a lot of houses recently done that are, I guess, contemporary classical architecture, and when they don't really understand how these things, where the dental mold really specifically goes, they start mixing things. It's kind of like molding all you can eat. It looks terrible. So a lot of the stuff I've seen is very overdone. They're not understanding where the proper placement of the water leaf goes between the frieze and the architrave. So a lot of the stuff you look at now is just, they're not really understanding the proper language of classical architecture, and they're making very bad Xeroxes of the originals. So.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, there's only 30 slides, but I mean, there is tons of information in one of these. And, when I first started as an intern, I would look at these, I thought, oh my gosh, those are all so beautiful. I love each one of these. But then I didn't really understand that there's a very specific language for each one of these. So when I scroll down and this is just a simple list of, I think at the end, I might have lost that slide. Hold on a minute. Now, these are just some these are just only three of the language of architectural publications. If you look at Vitruvius's drawings, he's one of the first to actually what's called codify the orders and, of course, the classical moldings. Then, of course, American Vignola, what William Ware did was he was, of course, a traditional neoclassical architect. He took all the columnar orders and simplified. I don't mean made them. I didn't mean by simplifying. I didn't mean dumbing them down. What he did was he clearly organized in the book how to properly proportion these things without going through thousands of charts and getting completely lost on how to properly draw these, because it is overwhelming to look through some of these images. It's like, I want to design. I'm building a house using a Ionic capital and the Ionic order. Where do I start? How do I even approach drawing this? Well, William Ware simplified things to where you can, as graphic designers and architects, you can reference his books as a way of, as kind of a simple beginning start. And let me go back to that. Yeah, that's a very, very widely known, well-published, very concise and clear language of drawings to really understand and draw from.
Well, those are all the questions that I have. This was a wonderful presentation, very informative. Thank you so much for doing this and going over everything so thoroughly.
Yeah, you're welcome. I appreciate it. And again, this is just a very small overview. There's thousands of different molding types. These are some very basic types. And then I can comprise this into a PDF, and I think Michelle, you and Valerie can probably email this to some of the members and some of the people that I think some of the students that were enrolled in the class last session.
Yeah, definitely. We can share those resources for sure.
Okay, good. Well, I think Michelle, that's I think about all I have. That's probably enough for everyone to digest.
Okay.
So I think I'll kind of end it. And thanks again for recording this. And I'll see you next time.